Okay, I call to order the June 12th, 2019 special public joint collaborative meeting with Cincinnati Public Schools and Cincinnati Preschool Promise. We welcome everyone and request everyone in the audience to please silence your cell phones and electronic devices. Please stand for the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Mrs. Wagner, please call the roll for the CPS board.
Mrs. Bates?
Present.
Ms. Bolton?
Present.
Mrs. Bowers?
Present.
Mr. Davis? Mr. Messer?
Present.
Mr. Morosky? Here. President Jones?
Here. Thank you. Father Graham, please call the roll for CPP board.
Thank you. Yusuf Ahmad.
Present.
Debbie Elsep. Terry England is an expected absence. Christine Fisher. Mike Graham, here I am. Tony Hobson, another expected absence. Gary Lindgren, another expected absence, as is Micah Camras. Toylin O'Neill. Odell Owens. Present. Cheryl Rose.
Present.
Laura San Regret.
Here.
Pastor Tate.
Present.
And Vanessa White.
Here.
There we go.
Thank you so much. Let me start by saying, and I'm going to offer a few opening remarks. On behalf of Cincinnati Public Schools, I welcome all of you here at the table, our partners, and folks in the audience. We welcome you to this collaborative meeting this evening. This joint meeting today is a signal of our committed partnership. This work is not without challenges. It's not without difference of opinions. It's not without growing pains. Our partnership is one of the most important things we plan and prepare for in the future of our city. Working together, we've been able to imagine, create, and implement a one-of-a-kind preschool opportunity for hundreds of children in our area. Today, we come together to re-energize commitment to the thousands of children who need access to high-quality early childhood education in order to become kindergarten-ready within Cincinnati Public Schools. This meeting is intended to reestablish this commitment, and we must set a tone of mutual trust, spirit of collaboration, and confidence to achieve the goals that were promised to our taxpayers. We must also be transparent to our taxpayers by reporting what is working and identify gaps that are needed in our collective support. What we want to come out of this meeting is a plan of action for how we move forward. At this time, I invite Preschool Promises Chair, Father Graham, to offer opening remarks. And after his remarks, we'll move forward, establish a few ground rules for tonight so that we can manage our time efficiently. Father Graham.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. The enthusiasm that greeted the onset of the meeting suggests that this has been a long time coming, and it has been, I think. But more precisely, it's been about, I'd say, 2 months in coming. You live stream these things too, don't you? So that's going to look really great on the news. At any rate, for the last couple of months, as we've contemplated a succession in the executive director position at Cincinnati Preschool Promise, this has become a kind of opportune moment for us to step back, see how it's going, assess where we are with multiple stakeholders across the community, CPS among them in a very important way, so as to create a kind of collaborative agenda for moving forward in a way that delivers on the promise that we made to the Cincinnati community several years ago. Much good work has been done. Much good work remains in front of us to do. It's a pleasure to be able to sit down with people who are deeply committed to engaging this work across the multiple stakeholder groups that we all come from and represent on behalf of our children. With all of you, I'm sure, and Carolyn in a special way, I look forward to identifying the big picture issues that we know we need to drill into in an ongoing way so as to enhance communication across our two groups and to identify those things that we need to collaborate most strongly on going forward. We'll get to those later, no surprise as to what some of them are. Topical areas like the master agreement or the upcoming levy, or the broader issues of how it is that we work together, communicate with one another, and the like. These are things that are solvable, and so I look forward to being able to work with all of you going forward on this. So once again, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm looking forward to the meeting very much.
Thank you, Father Graham. Just a few basic guidelines to help us keep the agenda on task. We want to respect everybody's time this evening. This is a large group, so I thought it was important, well, we thought it was important that we share a few guidelines that will help us stay on task. So as you can see on the agenda, we have four agenda items. We've established time frames for each agenda items. After each presentation, we'll take questions, comments from board members. And we are asking that board members be acknowledged by the floor if you want to speak, and to be short and succinct in your questions and conversation. Our staff is recording for minutes, and also Lauren Worley is going to help us keep track of some of the major themes as Father Graham spoke to the big picture. We want to make sure that we capture big picture challenges, opportunities, and other information. So while there's not an opportunity for public comment tonight, should anyone in the audience have questions or comments, please direct your questions or comments to our board office, and we'll make sure that they get incorporated into the written documentation, and we'll make sure that your questions and comments are responded to. So this is the first meeting, first of many meetings to set the foundation for the ongoing work, the work products that will come forward. And we're excited about this. And so having said that, I'm going to ask Father Graham if he would introduce the overview section.
Thank you very much. At your place, there's a preschool promise update that has some basic facts and figures on it, but to speak to those in a bit more detail, two members, Christine Fisher and Odell Owens, will be speaking about tuition assistance overview briefly, and about the Quality Improvement Initiative. I don't know which of you is going to be the leadoff hitter. Odell, it looks like it's you.
It's been accomplished, and again, I'll be brief. Nearly 1,000 students enrolled in our program this year. At the end of the year, 1,000 was enrolled and approved, and about 48 did not enroll in the community program. By the end of the year, we still had almost 800 enrollees. This year, 80% of the students that we enrolled were new, 20% were re-enrolled. Those numbers will flip, because last year we really focused at the beginning on just the 4-year-olds. It was only later in the year when we were trying to really increase the numbers, we went for the 3-year-olds. So now we're in the phase of still enrolling new people and re-enrolling. And we expect to be a lot more people coming back, especially those 3 going to 4. Just sort of a breakdown of the centers. There were 52 different community preschool locations. The most at one location was 68, yet there were 10 centers that had 1 or 2 students. So we feel that we really are accomplishing two things: getting kids enrolled and helping those small businesses get quality and be able to enroll more students. Most of those are owned by African American women. And it's a real, history has shown that's a real strong point in our community, and we want to strengthen that, not destroy it in any way. And I'll go over to quality to Christine.
So So I believe that raising the quality of preschool for all families in Cincinnati has the greatest impact of any of the work that we're doing. Every preschool that we're serving that improves their quality impacts every child within that center. And that's why we're really proud to report that we currently have 112 community-based preschool programs and family childcare homes working to improve their quality, aiming to achieve 3, 4, or 5 stars. There are about 1,000 children in those 112 preschools who are benefiting from CPP support. This year, 52 star increases have occurred due to the quality improvement efforts supported by Cincinnati Preschool Promise. That means many more children are now in programs that have increased their star ratings. We believe that one of the most important elements of high-quality preschool is consistent, knowledgeable, and committed teachers. And I've seen that with my own children. One of the biggest things is having consistency of staff and low turnover for their enjoyment and their quality of education. But community-based preschool traditionally pays low wages and do experience high turnover. Thus, we are committed to ensure that preschool teachers are paid a fair wage. We are pleased to say that due in part to tuition assistance that Preschool Promise is providing, most preschools serving children with tuition support are paying over $15 an hour. But some still do not. So we've launched Teacher Promise grants this year, and currently 57 teachers are receiving wage grants. Additionally, we have rolled out advancement bonuses for those teachers who achieve higher credentials. This is a newer initiative, and so far 3 teachers have received these bonuses. We're also in the early stages of planning new programs, and we're excited to announce the launch of Teacher Promise grants for teachers and other education staff working in those programs that are working toward 3, 4, and 5-star ratings. We haven't rolled this out yet, but there's more news to come. We're fully aware that the master agreement calls for competitive wages as part of our commitment to expand quality. While we feel like there's a lot more work to do in this area and that we're perhaps a little bit behind, we are now well on our way to achieving this goal and are fully committed to achieving it.
Thank you, Odell and Christine. To back up from their specific comments, in a big picture kind of way, we have thought of our work as falling into three large buckets: tuition assistance, quality improvement, and then the wage improvement piece. And we see the wage improvement piece as an absolutely integral part of delivering quality, because one of the things that stands in the way of quality improvement for many providers is being able to hang on to qualified teachers that they have. And so you'll expect to see more of this coming. If I were to step back and say, okay, so where are the shortcomings? Where are the things that we know that we want to work on? Something that we're very clear on as a CPP board, as you are clear on as a CPS board, I know, is that the genesis of this initiative had at its heart reaching students who most need this intervention, who can benefit most from quality preschool at the ages of 3 and 4. We're convinced that we are not beginning to reach all of the kids in the neighborhoods, especially the so-called quality deserts that suffer from a lack of preschools themselves. And so we know that we need to double down in terms of being present in the community, relating with the community, and know that the next permanent executive director that we hire and we'll talk about that later in the agenda, a very important job of theirs will be that presence in the community as the public face of that initiative, especially designed to drive enrollment in those critical sectors. I would welcome comments from others from either board as to what they believe the Preschool Promise initiative has accomplished to date, or what stands in front of it yet to be accomplished. And so I'll just cede the floor for whatever time remains for that.
Mr. Messer.
Yes, I'll start with some of the overview from the CPS perspective. But, you know, I think overall, the most exciting thing to me is, I think, the reason that we're all here, and that's that number of almost 1,700 babies have been served since this began. And I think that we need to be shouting that more from the mountaintops, because if you line those babies up or put all of them in Fountain Square, it would show us the success of this program to date. And as the father of a preschooler, I understand the value already in our first year of Olivier being enrolled. I can't imagine that all children wouldn't have access to that. And so I personally understand the importance and the impact of preschool. Thinking of kind of the overall successes, the impact from a CPS standpoint is that 41 classrooms have been impacted by students who wouldn't have otherwise had access to preschool. So that's all of those opportunities, all of those field trips, all of those learnings and social interactions that now have those opportunities. And one other thing I want to point out is that the success is not just going to be seen there. These are students who many will continue through CPS, and we will realize the impact on real students that I think we've all seen in data and research early on when many of us began working on this important community initiative. So, you know, I think overall, thinking about the depth and breadth of the impact, not just to our city, but, you know, right in our school district for many years to come.
Thank you. Other comments?
Vanessa White.
I think one of the accomplishments that we really need to recognize was this was based on a main tenet that the children who needed the most come from families who needed the most, and that we were committed to strengthening the delivery system, broadening and expanding that system of delivery, knowing that some children and some families need school year, school day, but we have many other families in our community who need all day, full day, because they're working multiple jobs and sometimes on the weekend. So we had a real commitment to expanding and strengthening that mixed delivery system of care. And I think that's been a great accomplishment.
Other comments, additions? Okay, you guys,
Can I add one more?
yes, you may.
Yeah, I think it should be called out. You know, my day job, I have had the opportunity in my career to work in startup environments when we've started a new division or launched a new category. And, you know, there are pros and cons to that. It's not going to be that you walk in and every day is going to be perfectly planned, and every day you're going to know, based on what you did last year, generally what you're going to be doing this year. I think it should be called out that the Preschool Promise team very specifically built something from the ground up, and that's not easy. And I think it's a huge accomplishment that we've gotten here today, especially thinking about the impact it's had on those 1,700. So I think there's a huge kudos and a debt of gratitude for the Preschool Promise team for building you know, this program and getting it off the ground.
Thank you again. Last call for comments on accomplishments and challenges.
I would just add to what Ryan said there a moment ago, that therefore our being together is evidence of a maturing organization on our side and a maturing initiative that's jointly held in trust for the children of Cincinnati.
Ms. Bates?
And I'll be the one with the challenge, right? But when we undertook the levy and sought the money, we knew from the RAND study that there were 9,000 children, 3- and 4-year-olds, within our district boundaries. And of course, not all families are going to want their children to attend preschool. So, but we're still not even halfway there, which I think would be reasonable, just as a ballpark. So that's our challenge, to find out how to outreach the families that we've not been able to reach and impact.
Thank you so much. I just to go ahead.
Well, since you offered a challenge, I think the challenge is this balance between finding families to get enrolled and getting those seats. Because we had a lot in the pipeline, and some of it as simple as helping people get some playground equipment, then they could step up, or helping them get insurance. So we're working hard. The one thing that I think we've accomplished is that we were appointed by different appointing bodies, and we have really tried to come together as a single board. We're not perfect, but I think for the time that we spent together, we've done a great job.
Great. Thank you again, everybody. So as we move on now to the presentations, we've allotted about 10 or 15 minutes for each presentation, and that includes presentation and questions and comments. So I'm going to ask Superintendent to please introduce our first presentation.
Gladly. Thank you. So the first presentation will be provided by CPS's General Counsel, Dan Hoying. He's going to do an overview of the master agreement scope of work. Thank you.
Hi, friend. Good evening. My name is Dan Hoying. I'm the General Counsel, the lawyer for Cincinnati Public Schools. I had the pleasure of being a part of the team that helped to put together the master agreement, not write it, but to gather comments from our board members and the United Way at the time to help put that together. So I was asked to give a background to that process and a short overview of the master agreement itself. And so that's what I have for you today. Just as it was deja vu to look back at my file on this and remember all the meetings that we had. Many of you were a part of those. Cheryl Rose was a part of all those meetings, and so my involvement. I know the preschool promise effort led by Greg Landsman and others started long before this, but my involvement really started when the then Superintendent Mary Ronan put together a memo actually addressed to Father Graham and I believe Jill Meyer from the Chamber, saying kind of our interest in partnering with a private entity to try to unleash and join with the private providers to further this goal of expanding preschool opportunities in the city. And so that started for me in April of 2016. I'll go through each one of these steps in a little more detail, but led on in the summer to lots of meetings at Dinsmore and Scholl, I think, was the law firm we were at, where eventually we put together a presentation for our board on a proposed governance structure. And those of you who were on our board at the time remember these big, flow charts that we had, and so I've got some of that in here as well, or at least I couldn't find an electronic version, but a kind of excerpt from that. In August, we worked very hard on a shared vision resolution. That probably took the most effort. It was a 2-page resolution that went through, I found like 25 drafts on my computer. I mean, just back and forth. And so if you haven't read that I think is really the heart of our partnership and the agreement. That's what the board and everyone, I believe, worked the hardest on to try to make sure every word of that resolution was right. I certainly can get you copies, and I'll talk a little bit more about that today. Ultimately, we ended up doing an RFP. What was difficult, and you've heard some of our board members talk about it, this was a unique concept. We didn't have any precedents to follow. And what we needed to show was that these public school levy dollars could be used and shared with private entities, not only the preschool promise, but private providers. And so we fit it into sort of a box of having a vendor. We have vendors for lots of things. I don't mean that in any way to be dismissive of the great work that the Preschool Promise has done, but we needed to be able to show our auditors and the state, that this was, we needed to have some kind of a precedent. And so working with Mark Janke from Katz Teller and Micah Camrus, who's still on the board, I believe, Brenda Weimer from Dinsmore, that's the kind of model we use to show the state that this was a proper public purpose, that using these dollars in this way was appropriate. And that's kind of how it explains some of the master agreement, I think. Ultimately, of course, the successful election in 2016. Again, I talked a little bit about the memo that the superintendent then Mary Ronan put together, saying that this is a shared goal that we have with Preschool Promise of expanding quality seats, and that we intended to expand but lacked the space and personnel to expand to all the students who we hoped to, and that was our interest in joining with the private providers. This is again, I couldn't find an electronic version, but roughly this is the proposed structure that we put together. If you'll remember, it was, I believe, Allison Kropp from Dinsmore helped us put this proposal together. Essentially, it consists of what we were calling the trusted entity, if you remember that. That's before we had identified the United Way as our partner. The Preschool Expansion Organization was the early name that was given to the what became the Cincinnati Preschool Promise. That name sort of being given, as I understand, from the Promise Forward, what the group now called Promise Forward. But again, I mean, you're well familiar with the structure of the board that was developed over that summer of 2016. Again, the shared vision resolution is what I would say is the single guiding document that we had the most work on, the most drafts. Every single word of that was scrutinized. And it consisted of 5 sort of principles. Tuition assistance and quality improvement funding would be a part of this, that $15 million of a $48 million levy would be set aside for preschool expansion, both in CPS and with private providers, and that would include tuition assistance concept and a quality improvement concept to bring up the quality of some private providers in the city. That CPS would retain fiscal responsibility and that the funds would be dispersed with transparency. These are next to quotes from that shared vision resolution. That there would be a common tuition funding formula, that tuition assistance would be calculated in the same way for CPS as it was for private providers. And that concept was included in the master agreement also. That we would maximize the number of children served by using a last dollar funding concept. That, in other words, we wanted to continue taking advantage of the Head Start federal dollars, the ECE state dollars, any other kind of grant funding, and this, we didn't want to lose those seats. We wanted to add this Preschool Promise funding to those existing funding sources. And finally, this concept of competitive wages for teachers and at least $15 for full-time instructors. That was very important, obviously, to our union partners, to the Amos Project, who was a part of the group that was moving the Preschool Promise forward. Again, that structure was identified in the shared vision resolution that we laid out in those big charts and flow charts. The concept of the Workforce Development Council was introduced in the shared vision resolution. It was established by the board to ensure that providers maintain professional working standards, wage parity, curriculum standards, and to report noncompliance to our board and actually the United Way is what it says. And that all contracts and funds would be dispersed consistent with board policies. After that shared vision resolution was passed by the board, we immediately, the next day, released an RFP to try to identify that trusted entity. We solicited organizations, a who's who of philanthropic organizations in the city. You'll recall, we solicited each one of those organizations, but the United Way ultimately was selected and announced as the trusted entity. That was about the 1st of September, with about 2 months to go before the actual levy vote. And then, of course, Election Day, it was a very successful election result, a $48 million levy with of that $15 million the board agreed to set aside for preschool expansion. And that's when the lawyers started meeting for the master agreement. And man, we had so many meetings. Here's an overview of what we ended up putting together. And I do want to say that there were, when we put the master agreement together, we did not have a model to follow. This was an unprecedented thing. We tried to include the broad concepts that were very important to our board, very important to the Preschool Promise, very important to the United Way. We also tried to make sure that there was flexibility going forward. There are, without a doubt, some vague terms used that were intended to be interpreted down the road because we didn't know as we sat there, certainly not the lawyers, for God's sake, how this ultimately would be managed. And so we again tried to make sure those important concepts were included, but to allow for flexibility. And we introduced concepts like the financial working group, which was intended to continue to meet to make sure there was a smooth flow of funds, that our board was getting the approvals that it needed, that God forbid the auditor came in and said, that we needed to switch gears, that agreement was flexible enough to account for all the things we didn't know. So there's about 8 or 9 different parts. I'll go through them quickly. The part 1 was a definition section. I pulled out a couple of the definitions that were focused on at the time, that a community provider would be an operator located within. I want to say one more disclaimer before I start. I haven't opened this file almost since we completed the master agreement negotiations, and I am well aware that the parties may have adapted, matured, I think, to steal Father Graham's term. And so there may be, this is a very literal reading of the master agreement. There may be concepts that have changed, and to that you'd have to look to the folks that are actually doing the work, the preschool promise staff, our staff. So to the extent I've missed something, it's likely because things have evolved since the master agreement was signed off on. But part 1 is a definition section. Again, these are the kind of some of the important definitions at the time, that community providers would be operators located within CPS. Importantly, that preschool students served would be CPS preschool students. Again, thinking that these are levy dollars, our mandate is to educate, CPS kids. And so that was an important definition. Quality, we were able very much to latch on to the Ohio concept of the step up to quality. At one point, we were worried about having to come up with our own quality rating scale and very much determined to rely on the states instead. And I believe that's still being done. I heard talk of the STAR concept in some of the opening comments. Part 2 talks about the allocation of funds. There's 4 broad categories of funds. Tuition assistance and quality improvement dollars. There's because we anticipate that there's lots of new preschool students, CPS has duties to serve the special education needs of those students, and we do so when they're not enrolled in one of our schools. We serve the special education needs of students through traveling, or what we call itinerant teams, and we anticipated that there'd be a need for more of those, and I think there has been a need for more itinerant special ed teams. So there's some funding for that CPS retains. There's administrative costs to go around, very maximum amounts for CPS and the United Way, and then what was called the PEO, what is now the Cincinnati Preschool Promise, has an agreement to minimize that administrative costs. I think everyone agreed that there's a need to try to get as many dollars into preschools as possible. And then additional costs, again, that's another one of those concepts that was flexible. And so there's flexibility even in that part 2 allocation of funds. Part 3 relates to the payment of funds. There's a flow of funds process that I believe has changed to some extent. We had set up monthly and quarterly and different types of payments. Now I believe most payments are made, I'm looking at Jen, quarterly. But what that section does establish is the financial working group, which I think was intended to try to smooth things out and to be able to have the flexibility to make changes as we began to implement this. Part 4 is what we talked about as the equation for tuition assistance. And again, remember there's that concept that we agreed to, and CPP agreed to, that we would have a uniform manner of determining tuition assistance, that CPS would get the same formula for its kids as private providers got for their kids. And so there's this formula that is still roughly, I believe, being used. The cost of quality is set forth. We had an agreed number for the 17-18 school year, which there's provisions that talk about how that can grow. There's a provider rating percentage. Again, our goal being to incentivize those 5-star providers by providing them the most compensation. An income adjuster, that actually goes down below the first 0 to 200%, but again, that the poorest kids are afforded the highest subsidy. Hours per day makes sense, that if you're a full-day preschooler, you would get 100%. If you're a half-day preschooler, you would get 50%. Days per week, again, very, very simplistic concept of if you're 5 days a week, you're at 100%. If you're 1 day a week, you would get 20% of the subsidy. And then subtracting out other available assistance. That, again, was intended to further that last eligible dollar concept. So if you are among the poorest kids at the best preschool, full-time, full day, then you would be eligible for, that preschool would be eligible for the full cost of quality, which in that first year was $85.81. There's the concept also in Part 4 of how we wanted to allocate, or how we wanted to prioritize the kids that would be served. So the first priority being the poorest 4-year-olds and moving from 4-year-olds to 3-year-olds. Part 5 relates to the quality improvement funds. So now beyond the tuition assistance, we also wanted to provide grants, quality improvement grants for the preschools that were not 3, 4, or 5-star, that were only 1 or 2-star, and how do we get them to be 3, 4, or 5-star by offering these grants. There's a benchmarking concept that's included in Part 5 that we want to evaluate and hold accountable the preschools that are accepting those funds. And then finally, a requirement to maintain audit control. Probably the quality improvement, Jen may say a word about this also, but the quality improvement funds were probably our most difficult to explain in terms of explaining that to the auditor. I recall that we had a meeting with the auditor where we said, look, we want to set aside $15 million of our levy, and some of that money is going to be going, from us to private preschools that aren't kids enrolled in Cincinnati public schools. And the pitch that we made was that they will be students at Cincinnati public schools. And if we wait until they're in kindergarten or first grade or second grade, we are already behind. And so this is an investment that we want to make, and it will benefit the school district. It will be a proper public purpose. And that was the pitch. What was even a step further is to say we want to make payments to private providers who are not even at this quality level yet. And so we did that by this kind of grant process and trying to maintain as much as possible some audit control for that funding. The remaining parts relate to the Workforce Development Council. You'll notice the language from the master agreement is verbatim the language that we agreed to in the shared vision resolution. So that was just cut and paste and brought into the master agreement as well. Part 7 relates to the compliance and reporting for the preschool promise organization. It starts by saying that there was an expectation that because these are public funds, they'd be handled transparently, consistent with the Public Meetings Act, the Open Meetings Act, and the Public Records Law. We specifically said that the school district would have the right to review records and that preschool promise meetings would be publicly announced. We required compliance with board policies. There's quarterly financial reports and annual audited financial statements required, monthly student participation and attendance reports, and then annual reports of programs, providers, and performance. That's in Part 8. The remainder is legal terms that no one had any problems with. That was the easiest part of the agreement to get negotiated. I did want to point out the term provision that's in the master agreement, which says that the agreement shall be effective through June 30, 2022, or until preschool levy funds are exhausted. And so that, I believe, is the overview of the master agreement.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Hoying. I'm going to open the floor for questions and comments. Ms. Alsop.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Hoying, for the masterpiece and the recitals. I have a question about amending the master agreement. There's a section on amendment, and it says that the agreement may be amended only by a written amendment signed by all parties. Specifically, what were the thoughts of the attorneys and people who put that together? Because we've arrived at a time of maturity when there's much interest in amending the master agreement.
So I'll just say that at my very first Cincinnati Preschool Promise meeting, I don't remember if it was the first, but it was the first or second or third. There was a whole slide that when I was presenting on the open meetings sunshine laws, and there was a whole slide about proposed amendments to the master agreement. It had not even been signed yet, and there was already proposals for amendments. So it's not necessarily new that we've heard that amendments are needed. I do think, and routinely I talk to Jake Purcell, who's counsel for Preschool Promise, and I talked to Mark Janke previously. Many times we've been able to say that there is language flexible enough in the master agreement that amendments aren't needed. This whole concept, I think, only works when the parties are working well together. So, we tried to include provisions that allowed for flexibility, allowed for future interpretation, allowed for change, but change that would still be, approved and authorized by our board, and the financial working group, I think, is probably the best example of that. But the specific answer to your question in terms of what was our thinking behind amendment, that's pretty stock language. That amendment requires written agreement of both parties. So I often encourage us to try to work with the existing language as opposed to make amendments, but that's just my opinion, so.
Thank you.
Yes, Ms. Rosen.
Thank you. And one thing that, Dan, thank you for sharing the shared vision resolution, because I remember as there were so many of us working towards this goal and achieving that shared vision. And I remember a step change when we really got into action and crafting the master agreement. And it came when we sat down together and we were able to collaborate instead of combating one another. Mm-hmm. We have a shared vision, and I do believe that if we can maintain that at the forefront and find ways in our operating rhythms with the structure that's in place, that's what's going to drive successful outcomes and get our kids in school.
Thank you. Other questions and comments? Mr. Messer?
Yes, I think maybe what I think I heard in there is at least some of this agreement was based on some guidance from the auditor and working through the auditor's vision or opinion on what is proper public purpose.
Right.
Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. Getting it. We know that there's a new sheriff in town in Columbus who, at least from everything that I've read, not had the chance to meet him yet, but that the governor is a huge proponent of early childhood, and that the culture in Columbus may be very different today than maybe it was even a year ago. So the question would be, is there an opportunity to re-engage, to get maybe an updated opinion of what the current climate is in Columbus as we start to make those decisions on kind of what is in that bucket of proper public purpose? Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, we can always engage. Yes. But, I've seen so far to the new auditors, he's as strict or stricter in some of his rulings, so, but there's always an opportunity to go and talk and, ask him our challenges, and look for guidance.
Thank you.
And then just to follow up, I mean, I think I would recommend that if there's an opportunity to do that, because in addition to that, then we've also heard that there may be some statewide initiatives on early childhood. And I think it'd be great to be, of course, at the table, and I'm sure people are at the table, but to kind of put that, and so yes, I think it's the new auditor, but I think the new governor is who's kind of setting an agenda that that may have some impact on that as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Did I see a hand on this side?
Yeah, I just want to ask if the presentation is going to be available. It was a great summary, and I know for some of our new board members on both sides, it's great to be able to see it in an executive summary type style to kind of get the high points.
Sure, of course, yeah.
All right.
I'm happy to send it over.
Thank you. Ms. Bolton, followed by Ms. White.
I think Mr. Messers hit on something that is very, very important, and that is using whatever skills and pressures and supporters that we have to secure additional state money for preschool and treating this as an innovative program. I'd much rather try to petition the governor and the legislature to increase, because we do know that they are increasing monies for preschool. How much is maybe left to us to push. I really wouldn't want to revisit with anybody else the proper public purpose, because I think we skated on that, very frankly. I think it was the innovative nature of this that made people say, oh, this is okay, because one of the assumptions is that all of these children are going to go to Cincinnati Public School. And so, you know, I would really use all of our, and we have a lot of power in this crescent right here. I would use all of that power to try to get more funding rather than revisiting proper public purpose. And Madam Chair, I didn't know, should we wait on some very specific questions about preschool after both presentations? And
what we can do, if you have some more specific questions for Daniel, and then we'll go to the next presentation.
Right.
In summary, if we want to go back and ask additional questions, we can do that.
that would be great. I do think that we do know that even in the Constitution of the United States, you have informal amendment. And I think looking back at the master agreement, we have been informally amending through practice, and that's not out of bounds.
Right.
As long as we are mutually agreeing and maybe squint our eyes and say, oh yeah, that's sort of what it says. I think that's the informal thing that we've been doing, and you have to do it. So I do think that we're obviously, based upon the agenda, it looks like we are going to revisit the master agreement in some way, shape, or form in a work group, possibly, if we agree to do that. The last thing I would say is, how shall I, the effort that we could see in the master agreement and in the shared vision, for me, is the issue of the deserts, and also the issue of the most in need of support, families and children. Because I do think that's within the spirit, not only of how we all campaign together for this, but also I think you can see that in a spiritual kind of way in the master agreement in specific language as well as thematic language. And that was the focus. And so I just want us to keep that kind of spirit part of the master agreement as well as the language of the master agreement. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. White, followed by Ms. Bates.
So, yeah, that was an amazing overview, and you brought back some sweet and not so sweet memories. But I did want to say that I think it was important, I mean, as we talk about revisiting the master agreement and being very specific about the changes we want, as opposed, I mean, as trying to redefine, because the one thing that I recollect is how you guys were constantly saying that what you were looking for, what we can do. You were always trying to, I remember going to the auditor and saying, it wasn't what can't we do, it was what can we do? And I think there was a lot of pushing on the limits to get to where we are and some of that flexibility. So I think it was more specific questions about can we do this, as opposed to we want to be able to expand this broad definition. It had to be very specific. So I would just, as a opportunity to be real specific, if we're going to go to an auditor who's even stricter, to kind of be asking for open flexibility, I don't think we'll find that.
Thank you. Ms. Bates?
Well, I kind of agree with Mr. Messer, and to piggyback on what Ms. Bolton said, I really do think we need to work with our governor, because he can, have additional funding put in the budget, but we don't necessarily want it just to be Head Start. I mean, that's great, but we want, and often the legislature, state board, and the governor are looking for innovative ways to support education, one-third of their budget. And what we're doing is innovative. So what I think would be powerful is if both boards had a joint resolution regarding an innovative way to request and to have this funding put in the budget. Not Head Start. This is not necessarily, would not fall under public preschool. This is really a new category. And if that was established, then the auditor would have to fall in line with the new way that we're proposing some funding. And this would not just help Cincinnati, but this model would also help the other districts and even some of the rural districts.
Thank you. Additional questions? Ms. Bates is always good for leading us into assignments, so thank you. But we're not there yet, but hopefully remember that when we come up in assignments as well. Any other questions? Father Graham?
If I could just make a comment, I appreciated the comments made about the master agreement, the need to keep it on the one hand determinative and yet flexible at the same time, right? So we need to know where the guardrails are and agree upon that. While knowing, as you said, you were setting out rules and regulations for something that you didn't quite know how it was going to go. And Vanessa captured well, I think, the spirit of it early on, trying to make sure that it was open to the kinds of adaptations that we would need to make. It would strike me, though, that from time to time, while trusting in the spirit of collaboration between the several organizations to adapt it as necessary, that it would be good to catalog those from time to time, step back, and then make sure that those are officially approved by the bodies as reflective of current praxis between CPS and the preschool promise. And so this is the kind of thing I suspect that we'll want to have a working group tasked to look at, well, so what adaptations have we made? For example, you cited the priority in which the funding would flow. Well, that's been kind of adapted, certainly. So that would be one such instance.
Thank you. We're in the plan for some next steps. How about that? How about Ms. Sandriette and then Ms. Bolton? Thanks. Sandriette, sorry.
I'm going to ask Sally to help me with this, but I know that recently the child care block has been improved, which is some of the, we were talking about last dollar in, that the children will receive in the private sector from ODJFS. That has been expanded, I know, because I was up and advocating, and I've been reading Groundwork Ohio, and so I know that stuff like that has been improved. I don't know exactly what the governor has envisioned, where he's going to place money, like you were saying, is it going to be Head Start? But that's a great start, because they're upping the amount of money that families can be earning to get those child care vouchers. So that helps us, because that's last dollar in. But I think we all know how expensive preschool is. It's an expensive thing to have. So getting the more money in gets some of the way, but it doesn't get us everywhere.
Thank you. Ms. Bolton?
Just as the superintendent announced, I guess, last week, we have an opportunity to indeed engage the governor, correct? Maybe Superintendent, maybe everyone knows, but at least the people that are watching might not know.
Unofficial.
It's unofficial that it's possible that a very nice man who lives in Columbus, who was recently elected, is very interested in coming here. And it would seem if we're going to have a joint resolution, it would be something that you would want to do by the time of the opening day of school. See, I kept it kind of,
You're just saying.
I'm just saying.
Great, thank you. Other questions or comments for Mr. Hoying or in general? Okay.
Thank you, friends.
Thank you, Mr. Hoying. Okay. Superintendent, would you introduce our next presentation, please?
Gladly, as our treasurer moves to the microphone. So Jennifer Wagner, our treasurer, will be providing a presentation on levy planning as it relates to year 2020.
So, good evening. Before I start, I just want to make one comment about proper public purpose. It's not, the issue wasn't so much on the funding of preschool, but it was what the money was being spent on. Private providers typically have more than just 3, 4, and 5-year-olds in their centers, and the money cannot be spent on infants and toddlers. And so that's kind of the crux of the confusion, and we just wanted to make sure that we were following proper protocol. So the CPS board members will remember seeing this grid as we presented it before as an overview of all the different levies that we have to face. But the levy that we're talking about tonight is a $48 million levy. It was first approved in November 2016, $15 million set aside for the expansion of preschool. The difference between this levy and the other ones that we have is that the ballot language asks the taxpayers to approve the immediate collection. So typically when we pass a levy in November, the tax values are in the next year, so you don't really start collecting it until a whole year later. This levy was different, and we asked for immediate collection, so we asked the taxpayers to retroactively approve that tax bill. So we started collecting in that first calendar year, 2017, so we ended up having a half of a fiscal year of collections. So that was year 1 of the levy. So 5-year levy, it expires in 2020, but we don't stop collecting until the calendar year 2021. That makes sense? So going forward for renewal in November 2020 would start that whole cycle back again. I know this is really busy and it warrants, but I'm trying to show the difference between calendar tax year and our fiscal year and the impact that the decision of when a levy gets approved will have on the budget cycle. So the top part are the tax years or calendar years. So they starts in January, ends in December. The big red star in the middle of that line is the November election. So the arrows at the top, when you talk about tax year 16 to 17, is how it shows how we collect in 17 the tax bills of 16, and so it's backwards looking. The bottom section shows our fiscal years. Fiscal year starts July 1, ends in June. So our budget cycle actually starts in the October-November timeframe of the previous year. And we have to do a 5-year forecast, cash forecast in October and in May of each year. So if we choose not to go forward with a levy, or if a levy is not successful in November, it has a very negative impact on our budget for that year because I can't certify a budget to pay. So we would have to, knowing that we had other options to pass a levy, we would have to prepare 2 budgets, one where the levy monies came in, but the 5-year forecast would show a deficit for that levy. Does that make sense? So the times that you're looking at for this particular levy is if you wanted to go early and take advantage of the primary in March, you have to, our Cincinnati Public School Board of Education has to pass 2 resolutions. The first resolution being it declares the need for the levy. That gets sent to the Hamilton County Auditor. He certifies the value, whatever dollar value we're asking for, calculates the millage, sends us the ballot language back. That goes into the second resolution where the Board of Education adopts the millage and the ballot language. That has to be done 90 days prior to the election. And then once that's done, like we just did Monday night, General Counsel and I truck it up to the Hamilton County Board of Elections, we submit it, and then we get our issue, and then we start campaigning. So if you're going to go for the March primary election cycle, the first resolution has to be passed by December 1st of 2019, the second resolution by December 11th of 2019. Originally, the original plan was to go forward, or a typical plan is to go in November 2020. Election day is the 3rd. So the first resolution has to be passed in July 26th and the second one August 5th. And then if you decide not to go November, there isn't a date on the March 20. I couldn't find a date on the March 2021 election cycle. They switched between March and May, so. But just letting you know that sometime in November, you would have to pass the first resolution, and then the second one would be in December. So what are our options for this levy? Option number one is to renew as it is a $48 million 5-year emergency levy. We could do a substitution and combine with one of our other levies. We could substitute and increase the amount and go with either a 5 or 10-year emergency levy. Or you could substitute and just increase the length of the levy, just like we did with the $65 million levy. Or you could do something really radical and just substitute and change the time. So those are the conversations that have to be done in a very public way. And we have a little bit of time to deal with that, but I was asked to just kind of give out the facts. So I'm happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you. Questions? Mr. Messer, followed by Ms. Fisher.
Thank you. I feel like deja vu. We just kind of went through this for the current round, which we want to make sure we get under our belt before we get too deep into this.
Right.
But I think as far as the options goes, maybe there's also another dimension as well, and that's on the timing. And I think, you know, to the entire group here, we've had lots of conversations, for many more years than myself, but of just what is the right timing and what election cycle is your demographic, who will be likely supportive, when will they show up, and then, you know, I think also what I kind of have learned is it's good to have a fallback plan. So you want to have it when, God forbid, something happens, that you'd have another opportunity to pass that to when your demographic would show up. So I guess my question is, you know, thinking about that 2020 year, which likely could be a very good year for those who may support this levy, if it makes sense to go in the primary and then have the general as a backup. So I think just the timing as well as kind of the construct maybe being both different options it could be played with.
So I've been thinking a lot about this, and you're absolutely right. So we're getting ready to unveil a strategic plan that we don't yet know what the long-term cost of that plan is yet. We're not far along enough in that process. But that is our smallest levy, and it's an opportunity. The timing is right, and an opportunity that we could actually increase it to help support the strategic plan. Just options to consider moving forward. And so you might, if that's the case, and it's going to be an increase, you might go for it in March and then plan in November if you need to. Change it. You can always scale back if you need to.
Thank you. Ms. Fisher?
Thanks for the presentation. Can you give a little bit of context of the other levies that Cincinnati Public Schools is having to plan in sort of this time frame? Because I think that weighs on the timing of options as well. My understanding is there's a levy this November, and so that also puts that March 10th, 20 to November 19 really close together. And so that context would be helpful.
Sure. So it is, the levy cycle is a little daunting. You have 3 levies in 4 years. And we are not the worst district out there. There's actually a district that has 4 in 5 years. But, so yes, we have the first one that's up for renewal is November of this year, 19. Then we have the $48 million that will come up traditionally November 2020. Then we skip a year in 2021 and 2022. The one we just passed, the $51 million levy, will come up for renewal as well. So the challenge is spacing them out, levy fatigue, and you really don't want to go for 2 levies in the same calendar year. It would be really difficult to pass.
So,
Ms. White?
I don't know if we've ever done, I mean, I know somebody does polling. Has there been any conversation about polling?
Related to
Ours.
this levy? The $48 million one?
Yeah.
Not recently. We've been focusing on the one that's coming up in November.
Okay. So, and then, the millage for the one in November? What are you asking for?
The millage is, it's $65 million fixed sum levy, so it's about a 10 mil levy. It'll be the fourth renewal.
Oops, sorry. Mr. Morosky?
Thank you, Treasurer Wagner. Thank you, President Jones. Just a couple question and a comment. Regarding the substitution and increasing amount, the substitution and increasing time, being that this levy is unique with the $48 million and the $15 million set aside, is there, and I'm not suggesting this, I'm just curious, is there opportunity or even possibility of increasing pieces of it? Like if you want to increase the operating dollars for CPS, keep preschool promise 15 million, increase preschool promise, or is that an option as well, just increasing part of it?
Yeah, absolutely. You can design it however you need to. So the ballot language of the $48 million was just $48 million for an emergency levy. It was our commitment, our public commitment to set aside 15 million.
That's right. Also, and regarding timeline, so I, like Ms. Fisher, was more against the March timeline, and my colleague, Vice President Messer, it kind of got me seeing things a little differently. I've talked to our levy folks and our campaigners who are out there and do things like polling and figuring out temperature of people. And in March is going to have a whole lot of people turning out that support what we do, and a whole lot of not people who don't support what we do. So I think it is actually worth considering, because I was more like you, Ms. Fisher. I thought it was way too soon, but I've kind of come around on that in some respects. I do think 2020 is absolutely the right year, though. And then last question, our third levy, that third one, when is that one up? Remind me.
The $51 million levy, that comes up in 2022.
22.
Yeah, we have 19, 20, we skip a year, and then 22. Unless we decide to go for a new money levy, which I hope we don't.
One more consideration.
Ms. White?
Just one more consideration to make sure, because this is a renewal coming up in November. God forbid it not pass, but if it doesn't, it has to go back on in March as well. So I think that I think the consideration to stay as far away from a renewal is the most important thing.
I have a question, Treasurer Wagner, in terms of the two substitutions, the one increasing the amount 5 or 10 years or increasing the time. Remind us, how does that impact the millage in each case? Are we talking about more dollars millage for a longer period, extended over a period of time, and it doesn't change? I'm just trying to...
So the time factor doesn't change millage, but the size does.
Okay.
And the values
Great.
at the time, right?
Okay.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Ms. Bolton.
And I hesitate to say this, but in the interest of transparency and people thinking through this, all of us together, it has to be faced as well that it's possible that the district will need money for other things. I mean, we are faced with growth, and we are close to our debt limit, and we have to be able to make major decisions about that. I mean, it's possible that we could be at 40,000 kids in a few years. It's very possible. So it makes it even more important for us to consider as best we can this situation, because there are cross pressures for the board and the district. And I think we just have to say that. I'm certainly not interested in that happening, but there are major issues, whether it's the negotiations we have with the city now, or whether, to Mrs. White's point, this particular 10-year renewal piece. and then our great need regarding capital, because again, there are demands on both the east side and the west side of town for us to have more, not just preschool seats, but other seats as well and other facilities. And that would require going to the voters in any big form. So we have to keep those things in mind as we move forward and think about this.
Point well taken, Ms. Bolton. Other questions or comments for Treasurer Wagner? Okay, so I think just in our next steps, I hope that people are really thinking about as a next step for planning around the levy, how we need to move forward on that. It would be great if we could come up with some concrete action steps for that. So when we get to that section, we can talk about it. Okay, so in closing our presentations, any more general comments or questions? Great, thank you. Okay, so moving on into our board, sorry.
You're busted.
My timer's on. We're on time, that's a good thing. So moving on to board matters, I'm going to ask, I am so sorry. I don't know how to work my phone. There it is. I'm sorry. Well, somebody has to keep time. But anyway, okay, I'm going to ask Father Graham to introduce the next subject under board matters.
Sure. Item number one is has to do with both short and long-term transition. Let me speak about short-term transition first and then go to long-term. The short-term transition plan, as you know, is sitting before us wearing her product of Cincinnati Public Schools t-shirt. She knew where she was coming tonight. So I'm very grateful, we're very grateful to Sally Westheimer for stepping up and into the breach and being willing to act as interim executive director for the Preschool Promise. Something that Sally had actually reached out to me about before the conversation about the potential for her taking on this role ever was surfaced. It had to do with bringing stakeholders from the various organizations who are all deeply interested in improving the preschool ecosystem here within the Cincinnati Public School District. Bring them together to come up with a kind of an agreed upon plan for what the action steps going forward in the upcoming year would be. And so to create a kind of alignment between CPP, CPS, Promise Forward, in a way that would, I think, really contribute to the vitality of the work as we moved it along. I eagerly jumped at the chance, and so Sally has begun to bring those groups of people together. There's been several conversations so far, and so I'm sure that out of that will come a kind of what I call a consent agenda, more or less, something that aligns us all such that we all see exactly what it is we want to do going forward in the course of the coming year. Our hope, and Sally's hope most of all, is that this is about a 90-day gig for her. So she keeps reminding us of that expressed intention. So that leads to the long-term transition. I'm pleased to say that Toylin O'Neill has volunteered to act as the chair of the search committee, and it would be a little premature for me to say too much about it because the CPP board will be briefed, happens to meet tomorrow, and they'll be briefed on this more, but this is, I'll kind of steal a page from E. Bolton's playbook and speak elliptically. So.
That's our favorite word.
Yeah. So what we've done several things. We've spoken to several individuals from the board about serving on a search committee, and they've agreed. The second thing is we've reached out to a potential search consultant to work out terms of how it is that they might support this initiative. Our goal this time is to hang on to more of the work ourselves, to source names and so on. We'll be coming back to you, for example, for names that you might suggest, and to use the group to be named later to support us in a back office kind of function going forward. And the third element. Let's see. is that we have yet to put together a position description as such. Something that will be vital to that is we've sought feedback from multiple stakeholder groups in the course of the last several weeks, so really about a month ago to several weeks ago, that include roughly 10 or 12 various organizations and the number of individuals with whom we've spoken as well. What we wanted to get from them was kind of desired characteristics in the next permanent executive director. We kind of know what we want, but if we've now had the opportunity to see an interim executive director and a permanent executive director in action, and so that allows us to kind of in a knowing, experienced way, say, well, we'd like to see more of this or more of that or whatever. And so we have that list of, or that compiled feedback, which I'll be sharing tomorrow with the Preschool Promise Board. What we also want to do is use that as a springboard for our own conversation about what it is that we're going to be looking for going forward, from which will come some kind of a document that will have desired characteristics and qualities and the like. I apologize that I'm not able to speak in more detail about it. It's just the timing is what it is. What I would say would be two things that we could really use from the CPS board members. First would be if there are people that you would like to suggest to us who you think could really do this job and do it well, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm graham@xavier.edu. And so just feel free to get the names to me, and then I'll make sure that they get in the appropriate hopper. The second thing is if you have suggestions to make as to qualities, characteristics that you would like to see, that you would think would be vital in the next permanent director of executive director of the Preschool Promise, please let us know those as well, so those can get folded into the conversation. I understand that we're going to be getting feedback soon from Promise Forward pursuant to that last topic, perhaps the first topic as well. So anything that you could get us in that way would be helpful. I'd be pleased to entertain any questions on either the short-term or the longer-term transition.
What's your timeline if as individuals or collectively as a board, we wanted to make recommendations? What's your timeline for submitting that? When do you need it?
So one of the things we're doing is putting together a timeline for the search, which I have not yet seen.
Okay.
So I would say soon.
Okay.
Safe to say.
All right. So Father Graham is willing to entertain questions or comments around the transition piece? Okay. All right. So do you want to introduce the next one as well?
Sure. In a way, we come to the heart of the matter, right? You know, there's these particular topic areas, master agreement, levy, and so on, where we know that we're going to need to figure out how it is we work, what it is we want to do going forward together, and so on. But really, this piece, partnership structure and alignment of shared vision, is an opportunity for us, I think, to hit the reset button, say what's been going well and what could go better. And so this is an opportunity, I think, for all board members from both boards to say kind of what they'd really like to see going forward and how it is that we could better engage one another. We've had various structures in place, the financial working group, for example, and there's been occasional meetings of the executive director and Vera Brooks and others to kind of talk through issues on an ongoing basis. But as you heard me say earlier, one of the things that we did here was a desire for the next executive director to be the public face of Preschool Promise in a way that we have not yet seen. I would imagine that one of the constituent groups with whom the next executive director would be the public face is precisely this body as well, in a very ongoing, rich, and impactful way. So I would be helped, we would be helped by hearing, once again, what seems to be going well and where could we make improvements. So I'll turn things over and let the discussion go where it will.
Okay, Mr. Morosky?
Thank you, President Jones, and thank you, Father Graham, for opening up the comments regarding the partnership piece. The one thing that comes to mind first, and I have a few things, but the only one I really want to focus on tonight is the third bullet, the communication piece. And I think, Father Graham, you kind of hinted to it and got to it directly, actually, when you were referring to the new executive director sort of being this public face and how that is part and parcel of interacting with this body. I would love to see more presence at our board meetings. I think the executive director is probably the right person for that, and maybe even a periodic, if not monthly, report out at Student Achievement Committee. It could be 5-10 minutes. I mean, we get the emails, but even just sitting here tonight being walked through this sheet by Dr. Owens and Ms. Fisher was nicer than the email. And so I think like a more permanent fixture, again, at Student Achievement for sure, but at these meetings as well. And then I would just say on our end, and we've talked about this in public session, so this is nothing new, but for those of you on the CPP board who don't live stream all of our meetings, I'm sure you all do. But one of the things that we talk about here a lot that's on us, I think, is also staying more tethered to the process through our 5 appointees. So that, I think, is on us. And then an executive director, perhaps, that's maybe more tethered to us as well. And I think that'll help a lot with a lot of these issues.
Yes, Ms. Bolton, followed by Mr. Owens.
I think
Dr.
that
Owens, sorry.
just by our own protocol and how we do business, and I think our Sergeant at Arms, Ms. Bates, would just substantiate this. I think it's important and actually required that one thing continue that is happening, which is the monthly reports to the Board Finance Committee. Because as a board, we cannot necessarily do something as a full board until we see what is being recommended or that the committee's system has worked its through. So I do think that, and I think that's been relatively disciplined and procedurally correct throughout the process. And probably in the earliest part, it was both the executive director and the finance person that came in the early months of Preschool Promise. I think that was more beneficial because you could expand the dialogue with not just the financial person, but also the person kind of running and understood the bigger picture as to why something would be done. So I do think that that's something that should, Treasurer has something? Yes, yeah, well, yes, he was
Right.
here. Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Owens.
Mr. Morosky just said, used the phrase, the 5 tethered appointees. And I just want to be clear on that role. When I was asked by Mary Rowland to join that task, Mary Rowland didn't give me any marching orders. It was a sense that you can be appointed to this board, and we have the ability to appoint 5 people. And when I joined the board, I think the first couple of months we were really trying to work to not to be divided, to be 4 different stakeholders. That really hasn't happened. It's still some of that, and I understand that. So I really like to have a clear understanding of what this board expects of those 5 people.
Okay. And I will say that I think that has been some of our conversation. We're also a little bit unclear. I think we started out with good sort of thinking and thoughts about how we work with our representatives, and certainly I think we need to revisit that. I think board members agree with that.
If I could jump in here, I run into this problem regularly at the university where we have different people who represent various constituencies on a variety of groups. And sometimes it's expected that they will be the conduits for conversation back and forth. Other times it's not. Sometimes you can't say anything. Sometimes you can. And so I suspect that a conversation of CPS board as to what their philosophical expectations, so to speak, of these of the folks on the CPP board would be. One of the things that is essential to us, and Odell kind of tiptoed up to this, I think, is that that while we all bring the perspectives of our nominating organization, it's CPP first, and the kids we serve first. And so we try to make sure that we kind of leave, not other allegiances at the door, so to speak, but we don't, we're trying to make sure that we're not operating at cross purposes in some way.
Yes. Mr. Messer?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question, Dr. Owens. And, you know, my belief is if somebody sought me based on the stakeholder group that I represented and said, you would be a great representative to this board, I would not expect somebody then to tell me everything I needed to do, or I would say you could have that role yourself. So, I mean, I think, you know, it's important to set the stage and make sure people have context and those types of things. But my personal opinion is I'm not going to be in every meeting and not privy to all the information that you will be as a board member to make decisions. That's my personal opinion. But one of kind of my thoughts is taking this up even maybe a level above where we are right now, and that is which things are made, which decisions are made by Preschool Promise, and then which decisions are made then jointly. And I think it would be very helpful to almost list those out very specifically, because I've heard opinions, oh, well, this has to be approved by the board. And some of those things I would look like, to me, look to be administrative decisions that have nothing to do with the financial. And so I don't know that I could pass a test if I had to say, how are things being decided today? Which things need to be approved by both boards? Which requires a vote? Are some just in form? And I think, you know, we've begun using a tool that's often used in kind of environments like this, a RACI diagram, where you call out for the various things that need to be decided on, responsible, accountable, and then some things are consult, where you might get their opinion, but still the decision owns by those who are responsible and accountable. Or some things are just informed, hey, this is the criteria. So of how we're gonna select an executive director. On that one, I think you consulted and asked for some opinion, which is great. So I think calling out high-level governance and being very specific about these are the things that are in bounds for Cincinnati Preschool Promise to make decisions on, and these things are the items and decisions that we make together. I think things would flow so much more smoothly beyond that.
I agree. Okay, Ms. Rosen, followed by Ms. White.
Thank you. And building on what Ryan's saying, you know, I love this RACI idea that you're presenting here. And I think as well, you know, the structure that the CPS board has in place today is fairly etched in stone. And I think one aha that we have had is how important it is to try to fit into that. Rather than create other meetings and other systems, how can we understand what those responsibilities are? And then we can back into our process and programs in a way that gets things done much easier. And I think that's been a miss. Any lack of communication, I think it's not been intentional. And I think that keeping the spirit open, that we want to collaborate and want this program to be successful, will help us.
Thank you. Ms. White.
Yeah, and you used that word spirit, and there's a spirit in a letter, right? And going back to those conversations that Dan referenced, there were lots of conversations back then. And I think the spirit of what Mary heard, the district's appointees were different than the spirit of the appointees from Preschool Promise, different than the spirit of the appointees from the United Way. Those were, the United Way mostly wanted a business impact. Mary's, and these were conversations that were had, wanted to make sure that organizations who were supportive of the district and supportive of levies were a part of the process. And so it's not about people being told what to do. It's really about people wanting to know how it's going. So when I go back and talk to the Preschool Promise Board, and I think people want to know how it's going, because there are people who have appointees out there who are not sure how things are going. And I think that would be the reason, if you were, Ryan, people come to you when you represent your group and you're appointed to certain boards, and they call you because they want to know, how's it going? You know, are the reasons why we put you there, are those things, is that voice being heard? And it is about voice. It really is about making sure that voice is being heard and represented.
Thank you. Mr. Morosky.
Yeah, and to clarify my choice of verb, I think Vanessa White said it better than I did, and that is kind of what I meant, because we don't get consistent feedback, and that is on us. I can point the finger at us, and that's on us. And I think this is a good first step toward that kind of line of communication that you're talking about, Ms. White, because that's where I think some of the breakdown can happen. I don't know as much about the Promise Forward United Way appointees, but I know about us. And so if we're gonna figure things out, we gotta be able to look in the mirror as well. And so I think that's something that we could do a better job with.
Yes, thank you. Ms. Bolton?
Yeah, again, the spirit, it would have been, I think actions speak louder than words. The fact that CPS, instead of appointing 5 employees to represent the district, we chose to send letters to particular, as Vanessa said, stakeholders that have always been supportive of us. So that confuses it right there for everybody, and that's understood. And I would say that the independent kind of decisions that our representatives could make often make sense, because your point is it's a separate board and they're doing it for the purpose of the kids as they understand it, rather than necessarily representing the interests of CPS. There are those issues, though, that do run counter to at least what the district would think would be in the interest of the district. And I think we have to be clearer about what those might be. And we can name a couple of them, but on the whole, I think I'm a little concerned about something that's been raised a little bit earlier in this particular conversation. And I appreciate Father Graham wanting to get input and whatever. I think it's absolutely essential that the Preschool Promise Board be absolutely independent. It has to be, just as we must be independent. We cannot try to influence what you're doing beyond talking to our representatives, or, you know, the liaison or the dialogue that occurs in the committee meetings or what have you. So I do want to put in a word about the sovereignty for folks on the Preschool Promise Board. And I do think that there are those issues. We get feedback. We get great feedback from Ms. Vera Brooks, and we get feedback in those committee meetings. We get feedback from the people that are actually doing stuff. I think what happens is that, to our fault, we have not necessarily met with our particular representatives. And I think that's where we have failed, because I think the administration is providing significant feedback for us in any number of ways, and I think you all have been on a monthly basis providing. But I do think that that is something for the new executive director to focus on the broader picture, because I don't know that we've gotten we've gotten great specifics, which is what you would expect from the administration, but the broader piece, I think, is where we have failed.
Father Graham?
What strikes me that would be useful, and this is to look down to the next item on establishing work groups and next steps and the like, would be to inventory the ways in which we already communicate with one another structurally and informally and so on, and figure out which of those could be improved and which are working just fine, and then to do kind of a gap analysis, what isn't happening that could. Cheryl made the comment, rightly so, that the more we can do this in a routine kind of way, the better off we're going to be, I think.
Great. Any other comments around that? And that was actually going to be my point, too. We need to identify where are the layers of communication now, because I remember going back to the original year, the first year, and I agree with you that I felt like there was more value as a collaboration and partnership because we were sitting down at every level. We had representatives on all these levels. We had a strategic planning group. We had all the subcommittee groups. And I think it felt like that as the program, as we developed, we kind of stopped visiting that. So I agree with your comment, and I agree with your idea about the diagram. So your comment, Ms. Rosen.
Yeah, one more consideration I'd like to add to the hopper is under the guise of governance. And Ms. Alsop and the Governance Committee for Preschool Promise Board have recently done a skills kind of analysis of board members. So I think it would be important going forward that there be some interaction amongst the appointing bodies to make sure that the skills are present on the board as a whole as you're making appointment decisions.
Thank you. Any other comments, just in general, related to the board matters items?
Can I'm sorry.
Dr.
So,
okay. Let me recognize Dr. Owens, and we'll come back to you, Ms. White. Thank you.
Right. Two things I want to address. When you're appointed by body, again, I'll use myself as an example. Mary Rowland appointed me without giving me marching orders, because I think the CPS board, you guys chose to choose stakeholders who you knew would put children first. You certainly have to appoint people that are supportive of CPS. That wouldn't be crazy. I mean, but not necessarily people who are branded or people who have been trained by you, but people who have demonstrated through their activities that they support education, support the children, and they have integrity. The difference is integrity. Regardless of all the other skill sets, they have to have integrity. And I think you've done a great job in those appointments. The people that I've worked with are five. To me, the great thing about all this is the easiest thing that we're lacking is communication. We solved that. As I said, it's been wonderful being here tonight. And I said to myself, wow, why did it take so long to do something as easy as this, to bring us together? So I think the biggest problem we're going to solve by simply saying, as you say, let our executive director be visible, and then somehow we need to communicate on some regular type basis, whatever that may be, once or twice a year.
Okay,
Yeah,
Ms. White.
I'm pretty much going to echo Dr. Owens's comments in terms of not getting bogged down in going through some SWATs and mazes and what have you. You are able to run for the Cincinnati, any school board, if you're 18 years old, and you are able to, and people bring you in because of your commitment and care to children. And on that, I don't see any gaps in any of the people sitting across this dais that we need to go through and start looking at, can they, do this or do that? That is the utmost important thing about bringing about success, is that we continue to say, we did this for the children. We did this to make sure they received 2 years of quality preschool. And even in that line, I was thinking about, because I'm just thinking about back to the 4 years that I've worked on this. Even the way we got to going to the 300% for the second year, if you were 4 years old, was because the studies show that children who are more impoverished benefit from 2 years of quality preschool. Every decision we make, if we could just root and ground this in our care and concern for the success of our students, both academically and social-emotionally, we will be very successful. If we continue to bog down with processes, other than doing what we said we would do and making sure that we do a really good job of relationship management out in the community, I think we need to move forward, because I think we spent a lot of time on trying to get processes and conversations about that stuff. So children first.
Dr. Owens, do you have your hand up? Oh, okay. Yes, Mr. Messer.
Yeah, and I want to echo, I was in one meeting and we were just trying to draw things out, and we're like, well, the financial decisions are here, and then this is over here, and this, and it just is, and then we have these liaisons, and then we have this, so there's tons of places you could go. And I would offer that I think this will solve lots of the world's challenges, having the group together, and that doing this twice a year out of the gates, I think storming, now we're in what I think we're in norming, and doing this twice a year without having to then add other meetings and these people and trying to figure out, just bring the groups together to say, hey, did we make progress? 6 months is going to go quickly. And so, I think it doesn't have to be overly drawn out. I think maybe the working groups, of course, that's more pressing to see some topics. But I do think that, having a couple of touch points in this norming phase will send us off into performing. And, we'll just have an annual celebration of just how great things are going.
Ms. Bates?
And I do want to say that even though I respect the sovereign ability of the CPP board, when it comes right down to it, we are, the Cincinnati School Board is responsible for the money. And if you do a great job, you're going to make us look good. And if it's not so good, we're the ones who are going to take the heat. So we really need to ensure that there's good communication, especially on big votes. Like the vote of raising, the threshold to 300% came as a surprise to us. And, perhaps with some explanation, we would have said, yeah, that makes sense. But that was something that, we were very much taken aback because we didn't even know that the vote was going to take place that day. And perhaps some communication and some rationale from CPS would have aided you in your decision or assuaged us. So that's the kind of communication on another level that I believe we need, and perhaps it's been the disconnect with the executive director and the superintendent, and that's the main reason why that's occurred, and hopefully that's going to be one of the criteria for the full-time executive director.
Mr. Messer, followed by Ms. Bolton.
Thank you. And frankly, that was one of the things, just in trying to figure this out, that was the question, because I heard like, oh, well, nobody asked us. And then I asked, well, do they have to? Because I didn't read that in I think that was more of an administrative. Now it's gray because maybe it's use of the funds, but I think as long as it didn't do anything that would violate how these dollars are used, it was expanding that. And I hate when it's 250 to 300. I wish we'd just call it out what that income is. These are still poor people. These are still poor people that I know, even people who aren't poor. Preschool's expensive. So if you're just kind of poor, I'm not thinking that's the first thing people are gonna, and so that whole 250, 300, it just, to me, if you really think about how many dollars that is for a family, but I think that is a great example. Maybe as we start to build this RACI, is that a R, an A, a C, or an I? Is that more of a consult? And so maybe there could have been some, hey, we'd love to get your input. But, I think that's why it's good to call these out, because it gets people aligned to a common set of expectations.
Thank you. Dr. Owens.
Just on terms of 300%, my understanding is that was promised to the community as part of the people who were out trying to get this levy passed. That's how it's kind of related to us. And it's certainly, well, I'll just say that.
Okay.
That it wasn't supposed to be a total surprise. Christine, am I correct? Didn't someone say, I think it was a representative from the business community, that this was always supposed to be on the table?
I think a lot of conversations happened and a lot of people were out campaigning, so messages, could have been out there in different ways, but my understanding is that it is within the master agreement to allow up to 300%. So to me, that is within then the purview of the CPP board to operate within. So the original discussions, I was not part of the board at that time, but obviously there were some original discussions for it to be in there.
I think that's, I'm sorry, Ms. Bolton, go ahead.
Yeah, well, we've gotten to it. with this specific example, I think, on the 300 piece. First of all, are we doing, or are people, I'll start over. The Finance Committee had already told Preschool Promise that we were not interested at the 300% before that vote took place. And it's a matter of record. And obviously, maybe that did not get back to Preschool Promise or back to our representatives, or let alone the preschool board. We were on the record against 300% when that took place, when it was presented to us. But here's the issue. Are we doing the 300% to raise the seats so that we have a better levy story? Or are we doing the 300% for some other reason, just to expand it for the good of everyone? My personal recollection from the campaign, let alone all the work leading up to that agreement, was that we were really going to try to take care of the families and the children who needed it the most. And that we were going to do whatever we could for those families and not get tired and say, well, let's expand it, let's do more, because we have not begun to scratch the surface of the families that need it the most, because we have not figured out, obviously, things like transportation. We've not figured out I think Vanessa mentioned the idea of a full day or a full year. And when you decide to spend money on 300% instead of something else, of digging deeper into those folks that need it the most, it's just like we get tired because it's so hard. And where are the children that are not the most prepared? It's that group. And this was never about universal preschool. It was never about childcare. It was about kindergarten readiness and an equity issue for those families. And I think so it was a philosophical piece. But I will say, when you are facing a levy, like we face a levy, you start making decisions that are about a levy instead of about your mission. And that's what we always have to guard against. And so I think the 300% was just that bridge too far. And I think it's great to talk about it and figure it out and whatever. But, and to Ryan's earlier part, what is it that CPS has to agree to? It's what Melanie said. When it's about the money, we have to be able to agree with it. And I think this has been a great discussion.
Yes. Father Graham, followed by Mr. Messer.
So, Eve, you capture really well the substance of the conversation that we had around this, actually. And so there was kind of a two-pronged conversation. One was that, and Ryan kind of summarized this, that there are folks who are not well off who want to access preschool. And in fact, the master agreement envisions 300% federal poverty level as a category. And so all of that made it in to the kind of preliminary thinking. And that for people who would be impacted by this would be an important decision. And it was not a negligible number, nor was the number so much that it would sort of rob our pockets and cripple our ability to really take care of kids who need it most. What the other part of the conversation that we had to do with what do we need to do to redouble our efforts for those kids, you know? And so for us, it was a kind of a both and decision that we were reaching, that we know through enhanced community engagement tactics and the like, that we need to do a better job of getting the word out in the communities where there are children who need this the most. And so please know that we are, this was, to the degree that what, is this a levy narrative? No, except for the people who voted for it who happen to fit into that bandwidth, you know, then maybe it is. But it really has to do with comprehensively doing everything that we can to get the kinds of students that we want to see benefit most from this in.
Thank you. Mr. Messer?
Yeah, so, I think some of this is also on us in our processes, because I actually just sent Phyllis a message to say, was I at that finance committee meeting? So I wasn't at that finance committee meeting when that was decided that we didn't support the 250 to 300. So that means only 2 members of our board weighed in, and then, I think that is on us to figure out then how, as we make decisions, is the entire board, just so that we're 100% all together on that. Because as these things go forward, if it's a financial, again, within the scope of what's allowed to be, or what's allowable for the auditor's purposes, I think that's, at least my opinion, where our position stops. And by the way, what is the dollar amount for 300%? Does anybody? What is that?
The last I've seen was $75,000 for a family of 4.
Thank you.
And as a parent of a preschooler, reasonable preschool at full cost is in the $1,000 a month range.
That was crucial to know, because I don't think we applied, our knowledge, we didn't have the knowledge around that income range, and I think that's worth some conversation and consideration around what all of us, I think, are agreeing on. And we want to serve the neediest kids. How it's going to impact us when it's opened up to 300%, but it doesn't mean that we can't find these kids who are out there in need. So we just need to have more conversation about that and plan for how we're going to achieve get 200%. Ms. Bate?
Right, and just for the record, because I was one of the 2 members at the Finance Committee meeting, we don't vote in our committee meetings. We make recommendations to the full board. This was in the minutes of the Finance Committee meeting. It was articulated by our chairman, and it was voted, it was accepted by vote of the entire board. So the full board was aware of our recommendation.
Madam Chair, can I just,
Yes,
real
Ms.
quick,
Bolton.
just to follow that up, because, and I think that Mr. Messer particularly is one of the more eloquent people about this. We even continued that discussion about what to do, and may even have made an assignment to the public affairs folks and to the superintendent about digging deeper into how can we have that richer public, probably wrong word, richer, come to think of it, deeper community engagement to serve those families. So we're thinking the same. Father Graham's point is well taken. It doesn't mean it's an either or necessarily, but we saw it as, again, forgetting the very families that are our families.
Okay, so we have about 4 minutes left under this topic, but if Ms. Fisher, do you have a final comment here?
Yes, I just wanted to make my comments about this. So I do think some of the context of the discussion often gets lost in a final vote, and that's the only piece that gets communicated. I don't recall any of the discussion being, for the purposes of the levy, we have to serve more higher income families. It is, though, very critical to us that we are serving the most number of kids who we can, with a prioritization on the families and the children who need it the most. And so that is always the broader context and the lens in which we are making these decisions. We do also have a budget reality that we have not been spending our full funds, and so we want to make sure that we are using the public's dollars to serve as many children and families as we can. And while we're going out and trying to find families who need it, who are living under 200% of the poverty line, I think at this point in the game, we also felt like it was really important to expand that as well, and that we felt like we really could afford to do both at the same time. And that was the clear prioritization of the board and the direction.
Other comments? Father Graham, last one.
I'll try to make it sound like a last one. No, what occurs to me is that what we have here is just a classic example of what we don't want to do again, right? You know, and so we're having a very robust conversation around this table, which had we had it earlier and together, we probably would have come out at a different position. One of the things that one of our board members observed was how awkward it would be for CPS to go out not supporting kids up to 300 and CPP to go out supporting people up to 300. How do you explain that, you know? And so that's something that, you know, we got that. We don't, the robust conversations belong early in the process such that we can all get into alignment about the key things going forward. And it's you know, Mike, you said earlier, it's on us to make sure that we're communicating with our folks. I think it's on us for us to identify some key points where we want to make sure that we're in dialogue and don't get in front of a decision too soon.
Okay, I think that's an excellent point to end this discussion on and move into, okay, we talked about an action plan. At this point, what are our next steps? And early in this meeting, I started hearing potential assignments, things that we wanted to do. So if we could just formalize these assignments into on our next steps, we'd be in a great place when we adjourn. So assignments, what do we want to do?
Okay.
Yes, Ms. Bates.
That's the one that you heard me articulating earlier, but it's it's a two-step assignment, and it's regarding working with the state on obtaining funding for more preschool using a different model than they currently use because our treasurer's having difficulty justifying what we do. So the first assignment would be to legal counsel, and to the administration to work through and articulate what we do and what kind of a funding model would support what we're doing here in Cincinnati with the preschool promise, the way we distribute our funds.
Got your assignment, that's clear. But could our government liaisons help us with that?
Well, that's the second part.
Okay.
Okay,
Great.
because first the administration has to figure that out. I'm not sure that, they take our message.
I got you. Okay.
So we have governmental affairs people we hire to do that. And Eric Kearney and George Glover. What?
I did not know that they would, I thought that it was like, that was like something that they were doing out of the kindness of their heart.
Oh, no, they're under contract. They are our contractors.
No, ma'am.
And if we ask them using their relationships and our administration's relationships with the state legislature and the governor, they will do that. And they attend every finance committee meeting and give a full report and get feedback and direction from the board. But we will direct them after we have a plan, and the plan would be first to come up with the funding model, and then for each of our boards to have a joint resolution supporting that funding model, and then we will give it to our governmental affairs consultants. Is that something that's agreeable to this body?
I think that's a great idea. You didn't recognize me, I'm sorry.
Yes, go ahead, Dr. Green.
I think that's a great idea. I also cannot help but think that there are other interested constituents within Cincinnati who likewise have their own networks and so on. And so I kind of wonder, it was observed earlier that we can access lots of people from the crescent around the table. So who else? I think we need to have, I'm perfectly content to have you folks driving this, but then to make sure that there's outreach such that this can become a kind of a community thing, because this is something to celebrate broadly, it seems to me. The achievements that we've had so far are to be celebrated broadly, but if they're leverageable for additional assistance, we should go for it.
Thank you. I just want to be clear in terms of what you're asking when you said, are you, the assignment was that this would be assigned to the board. are you wanting CPP's involvement in this part of it? Well, obviously, we have,
Think about it, I want to talk with Sally a little bit.
okay.
Because it strikes me that this is getting into the, kind of like the operational stuff that, you know, you on the ground would be very good with, and then, you know, getting some other people engaged with it as well. But
That's fine.
whatever shape it would take, we need to hammer that out, it seems to me.
Okay. And obviously,
Does that sound right?
I'm not sure how to do this. Yes, I have some thoughts on that, so I don't
Okay.
know what our role would be, but definitely know a little bit about what's happening in some other cities that's very similar, and those other cities may want to team with us in whatever efforts we make toward the state.
Yeah, so I think what I'm saying, to be a little more clear, is as this assignment is being worked through, that we want to make sure we touch base with Sally in operationalizing this. Obviously, the joint resolution is going to be a joint
Exactly,
effort. So,
exactly.
okay, yeah. Ryan?
Yeah, so I think, just based on some of the conversation, at least something that would help me is decision-making for dummies like me. Just so I know where do decisions lie, and so that if something comes into the hopper, you can say, okay, that falls in this category. Okay, well, why would we even vote on that? It's not even here. Oh, well, that one, sure, we got to document a vote on that one. Okay, so I think if we could come up with that kind of a matrix, a guide, that it will give us all something to refer to, as long as it's mutually developed.
And who do you see as responsible for that? Yourself and who else?
Well, I was going to say the chairs, or somebody the chairs would designate, but I think it has to be done, you know, the legal team, I think, needs to look at the agreement, so they would want to weigh in, but I think it's something that maybe once it's developed is then sourced, and then both boards would say, you know what, I think that's good. So I think there's a development phase, and then there's maybe an alignment that we would then get both boards to support.
Okay. Yes, Father Graham.
How about this? Ryan, you clearly have a lot of passion and expertise around this. What I'll do is I'll bring this up in our board meeting tomorrow and see if we can find somebody who can kind of accompany you, work with the attorneys, so as to get something to us in a draft form. Sound good?
Great. Thank you. Next, another assignment?
I'd like to add to the one that was just given, beyond the attorneys, we have to have our educators and our finance people be part of that. I'm not a big fan of turning this over to even our wonderful attorneys or yours. They can be there, but I'm not appointing Mr. Hoyne in charge of figuring out how to educate children. And he's very thankful. Look, he's very thankful to me. So I do think that the superintendent can figure out who that would be, and the treasurer can figure, and I'm sure Sally would appreciate that too.
Okay, great. All right. Ms. Fisher?
Yes, I think there's, to take a note from Vanessa White, without formalizing too far and creating all sorts of new structures, I do think that an assignment needs to be made of formalizing more of the communication. So Mr. Messer mentioned about decision-making and which decisions, but I'd love for at least something to be documented on more of the regular communication. Should this joint board happen twice a year, once a year? Should your board liaison join some of the CPP meetings? You know, how can we formalize some of those communication processes, not just the decision-making?
And who would you identify as working in this particular assignment? Who's responsible?
I mean, I think, again, this goes
In
to
addition
board
to
to
yourself.
board, so I don't know if, you know, each of the board chairs wants to assign a person from their respective boards to work together on documenting that. I assume from our board that it should be someone, one of the CPS nominees.
I think it should be chair to chair.
Chair to chair.
It should be high level, so there's no cracks, nothing falls through the cracks. It should be chair to chair.
Something that would be helpful.
Or either our executive director and the chair of this board.
Yeah.
Or a superintendent. It should be at a very high level to ensure that it happens.
I like the idea we should always have our leadership as part of it.
Yeah, right.
So
It's the,
our joints.
Superintendent.
yeah.
Mhm.
One thing that would be helpful would be getting that map that we spoke of, that inventories the current communication structures and opportunities, if you will, so that we have some sense as to what the,
Okay, we'll work through that. Okay, next assignment. Let's see if I can see something.
So I have a board meeting tomorrow, at board retreat in Adams County. So I gotta go home and walk around my house practicing my speech, if you don't. But thank you.
I thought you did this all off the top of your head.
Thank you. I honestly think we have captured sort of the major areas and major themes. And, I mean, we have four huge assignments. That's probably enough to start. Are we in agreement?
Although, it strikes me that having some kind of a levy strategy group
Oh, yeah,
percolating behind the
that's right.
scenes would be really useful. I heard a kind of coalescence around a March, November strategy, but that would need to be held lightly in light of whatever might happen in November 19. But then there are the other decisions, the 5 different options that Jen laid out, and we need to kind of weigh those and see and at least begin an exploratory conversation there. My guess is right now that's probably something that can percolate along at the staff level, and then they bring us stuff, because there isn't the urgency around this exactly.
Yeah.
So.
I would suggest.
Sure.
Finance Committee already has this as a topic ongoing. Is it possible to continue that? And I know that Preschool Promise attends that meeting, is that correct? Would that
Every month.
be
Oh, I'm
feasible?
we got a structure for it, sounds good to
Yeah,
me.
yeah, that's what we're saying.
Yeah.
There's a structure right now for that. Yes.
Madam Chair, if I could say that, at least for me in the closing, oftentimes when we do this, we spend way too much time on deficit assessment instead of the stuff that we're doing well. And I think it wouldn't be a bad idea, and I think it's been mentioned about an hour ago, that there are things that are working, and whether it's getting more seats or whatever, but I just, now that we've kind of come together, I think we need to be focusing also on the things that are working well, and embed those and strengthen those and use those as a model as to, rather than just focus quite so much, but what we have to, because we want to be perfect, focus more on the assets and rather than the deficits.
If I could build on that, Eve, what strikes me is that the work that we're going to be asking the finance group to do it's advising us so that we can make decisions on the levy in certain nuts and bolts kinds of ways. You know, when, how long, how much, and so on. But then there's going to be the communication element of that will spring into action, right? And your idea there about celebrating the narrative, so to speak, about those things that are going well, that's going to be really important there. The levy passes or does not pass, depending upon that narrative, I think.
Great. Sounds like a plan. Okay. Any other questions, comments? Okay. In closing, I want to thank everybody for attending, for participating, for offering up these wonderful ideas, and for starting this, re-energizing the commitment. So I really appreciate that. Having no other business before us, I declare the meeting adjourned. Wonderful.
Okay.